Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to continue our series on the Quintessential Quintuplets. So, if you haven't seen my previous videos on Volume 1 and 2, I'd recommend you check them out now since I'll be sort of building off of what was done in those. And if you like this type of content and want to be notified when the episode on Volume 4 is released, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are new here, the purpose of this video is to treat this manga the same way you would treat a literary classic in a high school or college English class. So basically that means we're going to take a look at the plot of each chapter, do a little character analysis, and then study things like character psychology and theme. So, as always, I like to start these off with a brief spoiler warning. This episode is going to cover spoilers from Volume 1 and 1 through 3, but we won't be spoiling anything from future volumes, however, so don't worry about me talking about how the series ends or anything like that. So, with that being said, let's jump into a quick recap of what we've read thus far, and then we'll start off with the first chapter of Volume 3. So, Futaro is a stellar student, but his family is super poor. He gets a part-time job tutoring quintuplets, but he made a horrible first impression on all of them. So now he must figure out how to motivate them to study so he can keep his job. Yotsuba turned down the basketball team so she could study. Miku is open to studying and has developed feelings for Futaro. Ichika is pursuing an acting career and likely has feelings for Futaro. Itsuki and Futaro still bicker but are getting along better. Nino is still very against Futaro, but he has earned some of her respect. She's also into his cousin, but that cousin doesn't actually exist, but we'll get into that later. So, with that being said, this volume begins with Chapter 15, What They Have Accumulated. So, Chapter 15 begins with Futaro checking in with the quintuplets. Itsuki is working hard, but since she isn't taking part in the study sessions, she's still doing really poorly. Nino ignored Futaro at school, so she's still being difficult. Yotsuba asks Futaro to guess what's different about her, and he completely ignores her. Side note, Futaro ignores Yotsuba a lot in this series. I feel like pretty much every other chapter there's a moment where she tries to get his attention, she'll boldly say she's going to save the day or something like that, and then he just completely acts like she didn't say anything at all. Ichika is more interested in the school trip that's coming up than studying, and Miku, however, surprises Futaro by studying English instead of just Japanese history, thus proving that she's working hard and actually taking this very seriously. So, Futaro receives a phone call from the quintuplets' father, and their father tells him that if even one of the quints fails the upcoming midterms, he will have to step down as their tutor. On a literary note, that means that the tension has just risen quite a lot. And that brings us to Chapter 16, Stubborn. So, Futaro offers to help Itsuki study and initially tries to be nice about it. However, when Itsuki points out that she was the first one to ask for help and that he rejected her, things quickly spiral into a pretty heated fight. Itsuki leaves the fight thinking that Futaro doesn't care about the quints and only cares about money. The next day, Futaro and the quints take a study break to play a board game called Life, and Futaro observes that he doesn't just have his life in his hands, he now has the futures of Araya and the quints in his hands, because basically if he gets fired, he won't get money, so he can't help Araya, but also as he's tutoring and instructing the quints, basically their academic career, which has further implications down the road, are all in his hands. So this sort of harkens back to what we discussed in the last video about why the plot feels so intense and significant. If you don't remember that, basically I was talking about how, this is ultimately just a story about a guy who tutors some sisters and apparently falls in love with one of them. But for some reason, it feels like a much more significant plot, and I'm attached to the characters in a way that I'm not usually attached to characters in just a romance sort of series. So I think part of it is realizing that the protagonist Futaro does have that much influence. So it's also worth noting that during this whole conversation, it's Miku who notices that Futaro is more stressed out than normal and asks him what's wrong. He's unsure if he should put the Quints under more pressure, and when Nino arrives, he realizes that he really shouldn't let her know, because otherwise she might intentionally fail so that he's fired and she can get rid of him. When Itsuki arrives, Futaro sort of tries to apologize, but she leaves before he can. Nino tries to push Futaro out the door, but Ichika unexpectedly suggests that Futaro spend the night to help the Quint study. So Futaro then attempts to apologize to Itsuki, and he explains that he'll be fired if they fail, and that's why he was so intense earlier. Unfortunately, he's actually talking to Nino, not Itsuki, during this moment, so now she knows the big secret. And this brings us to Chapter 17, The Night Study Group. So, as expected, Nino refuses to study. Miku, however, makes things interesting when she asks Futaro what type of girl he likes. Narratively, she's the first to earnestly bring up something like this, so keep that in mind as we're trying to figure out who the bride might be. Futaro answers by saying he likes someone who is always energetic, good at cooking, and loves her brother. So basically, he's avoiding really answering the question by describing his sister. However, it's worth noting that the first two descriptions fit Nino while also being the polar opposite of Miku, a detail that Miku notices. It's also worth noting that Nino was interested enough in his answer to pay attention, so she clearly somewhat cares about what type of girl he's into. In a way, it's kind of hard to tell if he's just describing his sister or if he's intentionally describing Nino to try to pull her into the study session, but I don't think he's quite that clever. So I think it's more that he's either subconsciously describing Nino or he's just messing with everyone and describing his sister. Since Miku has finished her homework, Ichika suggests Futaro praise her, which he does. Ichika asks if this flutters his heart, but he says no. We should also pause here to acknowledge that Ichika seems to be interested in Futaro, but is also playing matchmaker between Futaro and Miku. My guess is that this is some sort of self-destructive, selfless big sister sacrifice thing going on, but we'll have to, continue to read to see if we can find out more. So anyway, after Ichika asks if praising Miku gets Futaro's heart pounding, Ichika tells Yotsuba to check. Yotsuba rests her head on his chest to listen to his heartbeat and notes that his heart is racing. Now, does this mean that his heart is racing because of Miku or because Yotsuba got so close to him? I personally lean towards the Miku theory since he doesn't seem that flustered when Yotsuba gets close, and it feels narratively like she's observing that his heart is already racing. Otherwise, I feel like it would be more like, oh wow, his heart rate is speeding up right now. Medical stuff works different in fiction, so I feel like it's sort of, had his heart rate been super low, not interested in Miku. The fact that his heart rate was fast right when she puts her ear up to his, chest makes me think that it was in fact fluttering a bit for Miku. So Itsuki shows up and asks for Miku's headphones. The study group is allegedly so loud that Itsuki can't focus. However, it's worth noting that she is 100%, coming up with an excuse of getting Miku's headphones just so she can come downstairs and try to get Futaro to apologize. It's basically the equivalent of someone dramatically sighing really loudly. So Ichika, kind of picking up on this, invites Futaro to step outside with her. Also, even though Futaro tells Miku and Yotsuba to take a break, Miku continues to teach Yotsuba, which seems to make Futaro proud. Anyway, Ichika tells Futaro that she has passed the audition, but also asks if Futaro and Itsuki are fighting. Futaro says that Itsuki and him are always fighting. So Ichika agrees, but points out that this time it feels different. Usually they fight as friends, which is a good description of their relationship, sort of like friends who always fight. And she says she wants it to go back to that. Futaro praises Ichika's maturity, which flusters her, and this sort of mirrors Futaro's previous praise of Miku. I think it's very interesting that Ichika and Miku kind of keep getting the same attention from Futaro, and it's usually Miku going first. So, for example, Futaro calls Miku his partner, then he calls Ichika his partner. And here, Futaro pats Miku's head, and then he pats Ichika's head. And so they're both developing feelings for him, but there's also sort of this kind of territorialness happening as well. So anyway, meanwhile, Yotsuba asks where Futaro will sleep, and Miku offers her bed. Later that night, Miku wakes up and leaves her shared bed with Ichika. And when she returns, perhaps out of just sort of routine and habit, she returns to her own bed where Futaro is sleeping. And that brings us to chapter 18, Futaro the Lying Liar. So Futaro wakes up in bed next to Miku. Itsuki, meanwhile, on the advice of Ichika, dresses up as Miku to try to talk to Futaro. So basically the rest of the sisters think Miku left early in the morning. They don't know that Miku is in bed with Futaro. So Futaro opens the bedroom door to talk to Itsuki and correctly identifies her as Itsuki. This is important since he usually can't tell the difference. However, since he is trying to avoid the quintuplets finding out that Miku and him slept in the same bed, he rudely shuts the door in Itsuki's face, further hurting her feelings and just making things worse and worse and worse. So Yotsuba, Ichika, and Futaro head to the library, but Ichika sends Futaro back to the apartment so he has an opportunity to speak to Itsuki alone. Once he arrives, however, he bumps into Miku. He tells Miku that he slept on the living room floor, and she's relieved to hear this, meaning that she didn't intentionally sleep in the same bed. So presumably she woke up alone, realized she was in her bed, realized that Futaro was supposed to have been sleeping in that bed, and got super embarrassed, but he sort of covers for her. So Futaro finds Itsuki, but pretends to think that she's Miku. If you remember, she's wearing Miku's headphones, and that's sort of one of Miku's defining design characteristics. So he pretends to think that that's why he thinks Itsuki is Miku. And this way he can tutor her, so he's able to answer some of her questions about biology, and she's able to sort of swallow her pride and pretend to be Miku. Despite this false pretense, however, he apologizes and she apologizes too. And it's actually a very sweet moment, and we get this sort of 2-page image of the two of them studying together. And it's just it's a very heartwarming moment. So that brings us to chapter 19, The Death Road of Panic. So Futaro and the Quints accidentally sleep in on the day of the midterms, so they have to rush to school. Nino, however, seems set on sabotaging things and, takes her sweet time. Honestly, all of the Quints cause various issues on the way there. It's sort of like herding cats, but it's also in the name of comedy, so it's okay. No one's actually being a bad guy kind of thing. We don't hold it against them. The Quints are able to sneak past the teacher since they're all identical, so they all sort of pretend to be Yotsuba. So they can say, oh, I was in before the bell rang and I had to leave to help a teacher, that kind of thing. But Futaro, since he can't do that, gets dragged to the principal's office. As he leaves, however, he tells the girls to do their best and to believe in the work they've done. The girls encourage each other and all vow to fight like their lives depend on it. And that brings us to chapter 20, the midterms. So the Quints take their midterms, each with a different sort of reaction. So Miku acknowledges that the questions are hard, but that she knows her history well. She wonders how Futaro will react if she outscores him. Yotsuba gives up and decides to just guess all of the 4th options in the multiple choice questions. Nino, against her desires, remembers Futaro's instructions and advice. Ichika rushes through the exam and goes to take a nap, but then decides to double-check her work. Itsuki tries really hard, remembering that her father will fire Futaro even if just one of them fails. And she claims that she is trying hard for Raya's sake. So afterwards, the Quints meet up with Futaro to show him their scores. Miku asks him to help instruct them on what they got wrong, showing that she doesn't know, basically, the ultimatum that Futaro is in. So the Quints all got failing scores except for in one subject each. And thus begins a really good moment of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when there's tension in a scene where the audience knows something that the characters do not. So here, we know that this means that Futaro will be fired, but not all of the girls know this. And honestly, it's a really great scene. It kind of feels like Futaro is dramatically dying, and I genuinely felt sad about it, even though I knew there was still more story left, so he would likely get out of it. And also, again, you think, oh, well, it's just about a guy tutoring, some sisters. So it's very low stakes, but in the moment, it feels like the end of the world. So when the Quint's father calls Futaro and asks about how the Quints did, Futaro is prepared to tell the truth and, therefore be fired. Before he can do so, however, Nino grabs the phone and tells her father a bit of a lie. She tells him that they avoided failing all 5 subjects. It's notable that Miku seems the most upset by the prospect of Futaro not being their tutor anymore. Not only does she, first assume that he'll keep tutoring them, but she's the first to catch on to the fact that Futaro is essentially saying goodbye to all of them. She realizes that something's up. And then later, after Nino resolves the situation, Itsuki comforts Miku and tells her not to worry since Futaro's not going anywhere. And, to celebrate, Futaro takes all the Quints out for parfaits. So that brings us to chapter 21, The Magic Spell. So after Miku keeps making croquets in order to master the recipe, Futaro gets sick from eating so much food since he keeps eating it to help judge, her progress. And Itsuki and Nino try to leave to get lunch, but Futaro asks Yotsuba to lie to them to keep them in the apartment so they can hopefully all study. And Itsuki and Nino are surprisingly nice to Futaro, but after Yotsuba's lie is revealed, they leave. While Yotsuba and Futaro are alone, Yotsuba actually confesses that she's always by Futaro's side because she likes him. Before he can respond, however, she recants this by telling Futaro that she's just kidding and can lie when she wants to. As a quick aside, Yotsuba's face in this scene is very sweet and endearing, but Futaro looks absolutely horrified. His face is like splashed in shadow and his eyes look wide and terrified. Not sure what to do with that info, but I wanted to share it. It's said that after this incident, Futaro's heart becomes ever so slightly closed off. So, chapter 22, The Binding Lesson. So, Yotsuba, Miku, and Futaro all talk in the library. Futaro has been assigned the test of courage for the camping trip, and he plans on making it extra scary. Yotsuba discusses how there's a bonfire dance, and that a legend states that those who dance during it are bound together forever and will get married. Ichika asks Miku to pretend to be her and talk to a classmate, since Ichika has to run off for an acting thing. It turns out that the classmate is kind of a sketchy guy who has a crush on Ichika and wants to ask her to dance with him during the bonfire dance. Miku, as Ichika, tries to ask for time to consider it, but the guy is pushy. Futaro steps in to help Miku, but the guy continues to be pushy. As a result, Miku, as Ichika, says that she's already promised Futaro that she would dance with him. In their conversation, it also becomes clear to Miku that you ask someone out because you want them all to yourself. And that brings us to chapter 23, The Sextet's School Camping Trip. So Futaro and the girls go clothing shopping for the camping trip. Everyone is excited to go. Raya, however, develops a bad fever and Futaro has to take care of her. As a result, Futaro misses the bus to go to the camp, but Itsuki shows up and reveals that the girls brought their personal car to drive Futaro. In the end of the volume, a bunch of stuff is revealed sort of in relation to the trip. So Nino feels like she's seen the guy in Futaro's picture before, and remember, it's actually Futaro. Itsuki decides that she's going to test Futaro's resolve as a tutor. Ichika asks Miku if she can dance with Futaro. Miku agrees, but still seems a little bothered by the whole situation, and Yotsuba reaffirms her resolve to make memories with Futaro. So, with that summary done, let's get into our general thoughts on this volume. So, this volume is probably my favorite so far. There were a lot of cute and funny moments that really developed the relationship between the quintuplets and Futaro. As I mentioned earlier, the moment when Futaro feels like he has to quit was especially intense, and it's kind of funny just how serious it feels when you consider the actual context. I also feel like this volume showed Futaro actually clicking with the quintuplets in a way that he hasn't before. And it was nice to see them start to get along properly. And then I wanted to do the thing we've been doing for all these episodes, where we take a quick look at all of the girls and sort of theorize about who the bride might be and sort of chart their relationship to Futaro. So starting with Yotsuba. So Yotsuba is becoming a bit complicated. In this volume, she does confess her feelings to Futaro, but she also says that it's just a joke. It's kind of hard to tell with her. My guess is that she isn't joking, but is just too shy to be direct. That being said, Futaro does not seem interested in Yotsuba. There are multiple occasions where she tries to get his attention and he flat out ignores her. So, for example, she tries to show off the pattern on her bow and he just doesn't care. Furthermore, the way that she just sort of throws out all of the training she did with Futaro and just guesses for all of her answers seems almost mean-spirited. She basically disregarded all of his effort, even if she didn't mean it that way. It just seems weird that she didn't try, really. There's also the moment when she tries to listen to his heartbeat and his heart rate is high, but we still don't know if that's because of Miku or Yotsuba. And Futaro also doesn't seem to fully understand Yotsuba. For example, he doesn't realize that she isn't a good liar until it's too late with the whole him being sick on the floor thing. But he is learning more about her, which, is worth mentioning. Mainly, however, I just want to highlight again, how often he completely ignores her. I feel like if she's someone who will be his future bride, he would be more even unintentionally or unaware that he is interested in her, so he'd be paying more attention to her. But even in the previous volumes when he's looking in the crowd and stuff, he doesn't seem to be very focused on Yotsuba. So then there's Nino. So Nino had some development in this volume in regards to her relationship to Futaro, and she seems to see him more as a friend now, but only a little. It's notable that she did actually try on her exams and didn't sabotage him, however, and she also stood up for him against her dad, and she's the reason that he got to keep his job, so she definitely won some points for that. Nino is also pretty nice when it comes to making Futaro some porridge during the whole him laying sick on the floor scene, so she's, clearly warming up to him. And it's also interesting that she says she recognizes the young Futaro, because again, she doesn't know it's Futaro, but she says that she feels like she's seen this person before, and that's significant since, it seems like he met one of the quintuplets when he looked like that, so it could be Nino. And then we have Miku. So Miku seems to be making the most distance. So, she slept in the same bed as Futaro. She asked Futaro about what kind of girl he likes. When Futaro said he likes a girl who is good at cooking, she began practicing making croquettes. Miku was the most upset when Futaro almost got fired, and even Itsuki knew that she needed to comfort Miku. Miku worked the hardest on studying, which impressed Futaro. Futaro was also able to tell that it was Miku in bed when he woke up next to her. Miku potentially made Futaro's heart race with the whole praise scene. Miku was able to tell when Futaro is more stressed out than normal, so she seems to be able to read him on an emotional level better. And Miku also tries the hardest on the test for Futaro. Itsuki tries, but it's allegedly just for Raya. Then we have Ichika. So Ichika seems to be mostly sacrificing her own happiness for her sisters. She seems to be interested in Futaro. She gets flustered on the balcony, but also keeps trying to push Futaro and Miku together. She also seems to be the one that Futaro can be the most honest with, however. He seems to have a very easy time talking to her and sort of opening up about things that he's too embarrassed to talk about with the other girls. Ichika loses some points, however, since it seems like Futaro doesn't really care about her acting career. He never seems to be earnestly proud of her for her accomplishments and seems to not really take the whole thing too seriously. Ichika, however, does seem to be standing up for herself a bit with going to the bonfire dance with Futaro. So normally she would just let Miku do it, but this time she's choosing herself over her sisters. And then we have Itsuki. So if I had to bet money on who I rationally think will be the bride, I think I would put my money on Itsuki. This is mostly out of reading the meta of romance novels, however. So Ichika acknowledges that Futaro and Itsuki are so much alike that, that's what causes them to fight, which again is just like Elizabeth and Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. Also, the fighting so often feels like a hurdle that they need to get over in order to grow. So, early in the series, it seems like that would be a source of conflict, so that then when they hypothetically get together, it's because they've gotten over this sort of, struggle in communication. It's worth noting that, there's something about Itsuki that makes it hard for Futaro to be honest and earnest with her. He has a hard time apologizing to her and stuff like that. And that may be like a subconscious attraction to her. At the same time, I felt like his apology scene with Itsuki was like a genuinely really tender and sweet moment. Also, it's usually Itsuki who comes back to Futaro to help him. She comes back to him when the girls leave to get snacks and, brings her phone to him so he can answer the phone call from her dad. She's also the one who gets, the car to bring him to the camp, and she also tries really hard on the exams for him and for Raya. It's also notable that she's the one who sort of confronts her dad about the ultimatum that he's giving Futaro, and that's why she's aware of his whole situation. I also feel like the friendship with Raya gets her some extra brownie points as well. And finally, it's worth noting that Futaro can tell it's Itsuki even when she's dressed up as a Miku. So when she knocks on the door in the morning, he immediately is like, oh, it's Itsuki. And then later, even though Itsuki has Miku's headphones on, he's able to tell that it's her. And that just seems significant considering he always struggles with everybody else, except also Miku, but yeah. So in terms of themes and main ideas, I feel like this volume was less about theme and more about character development and relationship development. Futaro feels a lot closer to the girls now, and the girls who were already on his side are even more on his side, and those who were against him, like Nino, seem to tolerate him much more now. So, some final thoughts. I'm really interested in seeing how this camping trip plays out. Since they won't have the familiar context of the study groups, I'm really curious to see how their whole dynamic changes. So, make sure you subscribe to be notified when the episode on Volume 4 comes out. So that being said, I'm going to start to wrap this one up, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. Also, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Do you agree with my assessment of Yotsuba? Which girl do you think is the bride? And alternatively, which girl do you want to be the bride? Because I do think that's sort of two separate questions. But so let me know in the comments. I genuinely really enjoy reading and responding to all of them. That's sort of my favorite part of this whole channel. So that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care, and I will see you in the next one.